Okay. I had a little technical difficulty. I think I am recording. Brooke, can you tell if this is being recorded?
It's recording.
Okay, good. I promised a lot of people I would record it, so that was my big stress. Okay, so I'm going to get started here. So just to reiterate, for those of you who missed what I was saying at the beginning, if you hover your mouse toward the bottom of the screen, you should see something that says chat. And if you click on chat, you can type in any questions that you have, and we're going to go over that at the end of the program. So I'm just going to jump in and get started. I'm very excited to be giving you this presentation. I'm thrilled that you all came. So this is Dorothy Parker, the softer side of the sharpest wit. What I wanted to talk to you about was the sides of Dorothy Parker that you might not know about. First, we're going to go over some things about her life, her background. You might be familiar with some of it. You might not be familiar with other parts of it. So bear with me. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. We have a lot of information to go over today. Just to start a little bit, I want to tell you a little bit about who I am and why I know a bit about Dorothy Parker. I am a novelist, and I've been writing novels for a number of years. Several years ago, I got an idea to write a novel in which Dorothy Parker played a role. I'm a lifelong Dorothy Parker fan, and I thought it would be really fun to resurrect the ghost of Dorothy Parker in a modern setting as a character and have her wreak havoc and do all kinds of things. It was very important for me to pay respectful homage to Dorothy Parker and show all the many layers of who she was. So I spent a lot of time doing quite a good deal of research on her. During that time, while I was researching, you know, the thing about being a novelist is it's a very, isolating thing to do. And I was wondering if there were other Dorothy Parker fans like me out there. I really didn't know at that point how many of us there were. So I started the Facebook page that most of you belong to, thinking I might connect with maybe a few hundred like-minded souls. Well, now several years later, the page has over 180,000 followers. So apparently there are a good many of us out there who are Dorothy Parker fans. Okay, so now here we go and get started. Who was Dorothy Parker? She was the most famous literary wit of the 20th century. And I'm going to give you just a few of her quotes, because even though you might know some of them, the first thing I do in the morning is brush my teeth and sharpen my tongue. As some of you know, she answered her phone saying, "What fresh hell is this?" I think over the past few years, a lot of us have uttered that phrase. On hearing the famously taciturn President Coolidge had died, she said, "How could they tell?" And in one of her non-politically correct moments, she said, "That woman speaks 18 languages and can't say no in any of them." Okay, so let's talk about Parker's legacy. I'm sure that you know she was a poet. She was also a theater critic, a book reviewer, a brilliant short story writer, an essayist, and something many people don't know is that she was a screenwriter for a number of years. She actually left her beloved New York and lived in Los Angeles for a number of years as a screenwriter. In those days, you could work on a lot of movies and not be credited. But some of the movies one of the most famous movies she was credited for was A Star is Born. And that was the 1937 version with Frederick March and Janet Gaynor. She also worked on Hitchcock's Saboteur. And what's really interesting about that movie is that Dorothy Parker has a little Hitchcockian cameo in a very, very short, she actually says a line of dialogue. So if you ever get a chance to see Saboteur, keep your eyes wide open and see if you can spot Dorothy Parker. Okay, so as a poet, her work was very lively, often very dark. Often, she really understood love on a very on a very profound level. And that was what I related to her first when I discovered her as a teenager. I just couldn't believe how she sort of understood the human heart. So here are some of the poems that resonate with me, and I've noticed also resonate with a lot of the folks, you folks on the Dorothy Parker page. So this one is called Indian Summer. In youth, it was a way I had to do my best to please and change with every passing lad to suit his theories. But now I know the things I know and do the things I do. And if you do not like me so, to hell, my love, with you. You got to love a poem with a punchline, right? Okay. This is a shorter one called Comment. Oh, life is a glorious cycle of song, a medley of extemporanea, and love is a thing that can never go wrong. And I am Marie of Romania. You also have to love a poem that oozes sarcasm. Now, this one, just because of my personal circumstances, it hits kind of close to home. It's called Bohemia. Authors and actors and artists and such never know nothing and never know much. Sculptors and singers and those of their kidney tell their affairs from Seattle to Sydney. Playwrights and poets and such horses' necks start off from anywhere, end up at sex. Diarists, critics, and similar row never say nothing and never say no. People who do things exceed my endurance. God, for a man that solicits insurance. My favorite thing about that poem is the people who do things in initial caps, but also that last line. Okay, so now this next poem is the one you will probably think of as her most famous one. It's also probably her darkest. And as you may have guessed, it's Resume. Razors pain you, rivers are damp, acids stain you, and drugs cause cramp. Guns aren't lawful, nooses give, gas smells awful, you might as well live. Now, believe it or not, Dorothy Parker does have one poem that's even more famous than this. But the thing is, you might not even be aware that it's an actual poem with a title which has been published. And the title of this poem is News Item. When you hear it, I guarantee it will sound familiar. Men seldom make passes at girls who wear glasses. See, you have heard it before, right? I knew you had. Okay, so I'm going to pretend I hear you and see you. All right, as a critic, she has said things like, this is not a novel to be tossed aside lightly. It should be thrown with great force. Now, there's always a lot of controversy about this line because it doesn't appear in any written review. It's a line that's been passed down verbally. And many people believe that she said this about Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged because she clearly did not like that book. But in truth, we don't know what novel she was talking about. That little bit of information never got passed down. Dorothy Parker, in her early days as a theater critic, got to see a young Katharine Hepburn in her very earliest performance when she hadn't yet honed her craft. And what Parker had said was, Katharine Hepburn ran the gamut of emotions from A to B. About another play, she had quipped, the house beautiful is, for me, the play lousy. Now, I want to just take 1 minute to talk about her years as a book reviewer for The New Yorker. She did not write under the name Dorothy Parker. She wrote under the name Constant Reader. That was her pen name. It's important to remember that when she wrote for The New Yorker. Her pen name was Constant Reader. And it's also important to know that Mrs. Parker had absolutely no tolerance for whimsy. So this is what she had to say about A.A. Milne's The House at Pooh Corner. Tiddly what? Said Piglet. He took, as you might say, the very words out of your correspondent's mouth. Pom, said Pooh, I put that in to make it more hummy. And it is that word hummy, my darlings, that marks the first place in The House at Pooh Corner at which Constant Reader flowed up. Okay, so now let's talk for a moment about her career as a short story writer. Dorothy Parker always did want to be a novelist. She beat herself up that she never accomplished that. But her short stories were absolutely brilliant. And in 1929, she won the prestigious O. Henry Award for her short story, The Big Blonde. But here's a line from her short story, A Telephone Call, which I think is just wonderful. I was always sweet at first. Oh, it's so easy to be sweet to people before you love them. And this is a beautiful line of prose from Dusk Before Fireworks. His voice was as intimate as the rustle of sheets. I think that's gorgeous. Okay. As an essayist, listen, some of you may have read an excerpt, which was an homage to New York that she wrote for it was called My Hometown. And it was printed in McCall's in 1928. It's such beautiful writing. I'm going to read a really big chunk of it here that goes through several slides. But, this is part of my love for Dorothy Parker. So I hope you'll indulge me and forgive me. But it's such gorgeous writing. I really want to share it with you. So here we go. From My Hometown. It occurs to me that there are other towns. It occurs to me so violently that I say at intervals, very well, if New York is going to be like this, I'm going to live somewhere else. And I do. That's the funny part of it. But then one day there comes to me the sharp picture of New York at its best on a shiny blue and white autumn day, with its buildings cut diagonally in halves of light and shadow, with its straight, neat avenues colored with quick throngs, like confetti in a breeze. Someone, and I wish it had been I, has said that autumn is the springtime of big cities. I see New York at holiday time, always in the late afternoon, under a Maxfield Parish sky, with the crowds even more quick and nervous, but even more good-natured, the dark groups splashed with the white of Christmas packages, the lighted holly-strung shops, urging them in to buy more and more. I see it on a spring morning, with the clothes of the women as soft and as hopeful as the pretty new leaves on a few brave trees. I see it at night, with the low skies red with the black flung lights of Broadway, those lights of which Chesterton, or they told me it was Chesterton, said, "What a marvelous sight for those who cannot read." I see it in the rain. I smell the enchanting odor of wet asphalt, with the empty streets black and shining as ripe olives. I see it. By this time I become maudlin with nostalgia, even with its gray mounds of crusted snow, its little Appalachians of ice along the pavements. So I go back, and it is always better than I thought it would be. I suppose that is the thing about New York. It is always a little more than you had hoped for. Each day there is so definitely a new day. Now we'll start over, it seems to say every morning, and come on, let's hurry like anything. London is satisfied, Paris is resigned, but New York is always hopeful. Always it believes that something good is about to come off, and it must hurry to meet it. There is excitement ever running its streets. Each day as you go out, you feel the little nervous quiver that is yours when you sit in a theater just before the curtain rises. Other places may give you a sweet and soothing sense of level, but in New York, there is always the feeling of something's going to happen. It isn't peace, but you do get used to peace and so quickly, and you never get used to New York. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm just absolutely rapturous over that particular piece of prose. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about Dorothy Parker's early life. Um, Okay. She was born in West End, New Jersey in 1893. Um, she was the youngest of four children. Of course, Dorothy Parker would have wished to have been born in New York, but her family was on vacation, and so she was born in New Jersey. Um, Her father was of German Jewish descent. Her mother was of Protestant Scottish descent. Dorothy Parker's mother died when she was 4 years old. Her father remarried a woman she didn't very much like. In fact, she refused to call her anything but Mrs. Rothschild, which, by the way, I guess I should mention, she wasn't born Dorothy Parker. She was born Dorothy Rothschild. And I'll get to the Parker part in a few minutes. And then her stepmother died when she was 9 years old. So there was a lot of death in her young life. Interestingly, because of her stepmother, she attended a Roman Catholic elementary school, despite the fact that she was Jewish, or at least half Jewish. Um, Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the fact that she went to finishing school, because this is a part of her history. Honestly, there are a lot of big gaps in what we know about Dorothy Parker. And again, I'm going to get into some of that toward the end of the presentation when I talk about what happened to her writings and her papers and research on her. But there are a lot of big gaps in what we know about Dorothy Parker's life. But we do know this. We know that she was very eager to go to this boarding school when she was a young teenager. Very eager. She was excited to go. We know that she went away, and she came back after a year and never went back again. Now, it might be because I'm a novelist and I tend to make stories out of everything. We really don't know why she dropped out, but we do know that it was a very sort of white Anglo-Saxon school, and Dorothy was probably the only Jewish girl there. We also know that anti-Semitism was quite blatant at that time. So it's very possible that that was the reason she dropped out and never went back. But what we do know that was the end of her formal education. So we're going to talk about her early career. How did she get started as a writer? When Dorothy Parker was 19 years old, her father died. So at that point, she was officially an orphan. And she went to live with her older sister, Helen, and her brother-in-law, and they had one child at that time. And she was making a living, believe it or not, by playing the piano at dance studios. Dance studios were all the craze at that particular time in New York. Everyone was learning to do the castle walk. So she was playing the piano in dance studios as people learned how to dance. This, of course, was not what she wanted to do with her life. And so she was writing poems, and she was sending them out to various publications and piling up rejections, as writers do. And then one time she sent one poem to Vanity Fair, which was a new, sophisticated, cutting edge, very cosmopolitan, very urban magazine. And she got an acceptance and a check, which was a very, very big deal for young Dorothy. So what did she do? She thought this could possibly be the start of her life. And she put on her best suit and she went to the offices of Vanity Fair. And she called on the editor-in-chief, Frank Crowninshield, and made a pitch for herself that she wanted a job with the magazine. Frank Crowninshield told her there were no positions open at the magazine at that time, but he would keep his eyes open for her. Sure enough, a few months later, a job became available at Vogue magazine, which was under the same ownership as Vanity Fair. It was one of their sister publications. So he had Dorothy Parker come in and interview, and she got the job as sort of a lower level editorial assistant and caption writer for Vogue in 1914. So one of the captions she famously wrote, the young literate Dorothy Rothschild wrote, was "Brevity is the soul of lingerie." She also wrote, and you'll have to pardon me for butchering the French, there was a little girl who had a little curl right in the middle of her forehead. When she was good, she was very, very good. And when she was bad, she wore this divine nightdress of rose-colored mousseline de soie, trimmed with frosty Valenciennes lace. So that was Dorothy Parker insinuating in 1914 that people actually had sex. It was very risque. I don't think that one actually made the publication. Okay, so in 1918, she was moved from Vogue to Vanity Fair. Frank Crowninshield clearly recognized that he had somebody very, very special, a very special young writer in his midst. He didn't quite know what to do with her. However, very soon after that, his theater critic went on hiatus, and he made Dorothy Parker the theater critic for Vanity Fair. She instantly became a celebrated theater critic. Her reviews were not just witty, but they were vibrant and they were alive and had a voice that feels fresh today, 100 years later. If you read these reviews, I trust me, you will be astonished at the voice. So you can understand why, if somebody wrote with that fresh and lively and like earth-shattering voice that no one had ever heard before, why she would become such an instant sensation. And she did. At 24 years old, she was the toast of the town in New York City. While she was at Vanity Fair, she met her co-workers, Robert Benchley, the humorist, who would go on to be a lifelong friend of hers, and Robert Sherwood, who went on to become a playwright. Oh, by the way, in this picture, that's Alexander Woollcott, that's Dorothy Parker. This gentleman back here, believe it or not, is Harpo Marx. Okay, so she was invited to the first Algonquin Roundtable luncheon in 1919. And she took her friends, Robert Benchley and Robert Sherwood, with her. I do want to talk for a moment about the Algonquin Roundtable. For those who don't know, they were a celebrated group of wits who met daily for lunch at the hotel. This is a famous cartoon by Hirschfeld, and it shows many of the early and frequent members of the Algonquin Roundtable. And starting with Mrs. Parker on the left, that's Dorothy Parker. Above her and to the right, that is Robert Benchley. This is the fellow in the glasses is Alexander Woollcott. He was the theater critic for the New York Times, a great wit himself. Next to Woollcott is Haywood Broun, who, even though his name might not be familiar to people now, he was probably one of the more famous writers at the table at the time. He was a very well-known sports writer. Next to Haywood Broun is Mark Connolly, who was a playwright and collaborated on a lot of plays with George S. Kaufman. On the other end, with the big mustache and the big cigar, is Franklin Pierce Adams, also called FPA. He was largely responsible for getting the Algonquin Roundtable so famous because he had a column and he would quote them in his column. And readers came to know them, and they literally became celebrities because of his column. Next to him is the novelist and playwright Edna Ferber, who you probably know is the author of Showboat, which was turned into a musical. Next to Edna Ferber, with his back to us, is George S. Kaufman, who wrote several of the Marx Brothers shows and movies, in addition to other things. And then this tall, skinny fellow on the end is playwright Robert Sherwood. And then in the background, for many years, I thought that was Tallulah Bankhead, but it is not. Wait, I gotta go back. That's actually the acting team of Lunt and Fontaine. And the man in the checkered jacket next to them is Frank Crowninshield, who was her boss. And then over on the right-hand side, that's Frank Case, who was the manager of the Algonquin. So going on to talk a little bit more about the origin story of the Algonquin Roundtable. It began in 1919 as a practical joke played on Alexander Woollcott. A publicist named John Peter Toohey was actually miffed at Alexander Woollcott and decided to play a joke on him. He pretended to throw him a welcome home from the war party when it was really kind of a roast. And Woollcott absolutely loved it and wanted to make it a daily ritual for them to have lunch. So it started at a rectangular table. It was in the Oak Room. They didn't always call themselves the Algonquin Round Table. They originally called themselves the board. And then the Luigi board, which you have to appreciate because A, their waiter was named Luigi, and B, Ouija boards were a huge craze at that time. So that was actually very witty that they called it the Luigi board. And Dorothy Parker actually preferred to call it the vicious circle. But it was the Algonquin Round Table, which stuck. And the luncheons continued until 1929. And don't think that Dorothy Parker was there every day. She couldn't afford to eat lunch at the Algonquin every day. She was a sometime member of the Algonquin Round Table, but quite celebrated because everybody there was a wit, but she really shined like a star. So now to go through just some of the folks, highlights of the folks who were members of the Algonquin Round Table. Here's a famous witticism from Alexander Woollcott. He once said, "All the things I really like to do are either immoral, illegal, or fattening." He also said about actors and prostitutes, the two oldest professions in the world, ruined by amateurs. Mark Connolly. So at the Algonquin, a man came over to Mark Connolly and ran his hand over Connolly's bald pate and said, "You know, Mark, your head feels as smooth as my wife's behind." Without missing a beat, Connolly ran his own hand over his head and said, "So it does." Robert Benchley. On discussing a Broadway show, Benchley said, "It was one of those plays in which all the actors unfortunately enunciated very clearly." A show I think he didn't like much. And I kind of like this one. "There may be said to be two classes of people in the world, those who constantly divide the people of the world into two classes and those who do not." Okay, Tallulah, who was incredibly risque. And it is hard to find Tallulah quotes that are, clean enough to do in a presentation where I don't know if there are going to be any little kiddies in the room. So I'm going to do my best here. Tallulah said, "I'm as pure as the driven slush." She also said, "I'll come and make love to you at 5 o'clock. If I'm late, start without me." That's Tallulah. Ring Lardner, a sports writer and short story writer with an incredible voice. Ring Lardner has a quote, "He looked at me as if I were a side dish he hadn't ordered." I always want to remember that, want to use it sometime. Here's another thing Ring Lardner wrote. "Shut up," he explained. Okay, George S. Kaufman, the very punny George S. Kaufman, said, "I like terra firma. The more firma, the less terra." Also, he had said to a fellow playwright, "I understand your new play is full of single entendres." Okay, so Edna Ferber was dressed in a tailor jacket, much like the one Noel Coward showed up wearing. So he came into the room and they kind of looked like twins, I guess. And when he saw her, he said, "Edna, you look almost like a man in that suit." To which Ferber replied, "So do you, Noel." Okay, Robert Sherwood on cowboy Tom Mix said, They say he rides as if he's part of the horse, but they don't say which part. And FPA, Franklin Pierce Adams, said, "Nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad old memory." I think that's pretty true. And of course, there was Dorothy Parker herself. Like I said, always the sharpest wit in the room. On being asked to use the word horticulture in a sentence, she said, "You can lead a horticulture, but you can't make her think." And she also said, "You can't teach an old dogma new tricks." And famously, "One more drink and I'd have been under the host." And now I'm going to talk for a bit about her marriages. I also want to remind you, if you do have any questions, like I said, feel free to type them in the chat as we're going along. Okay, so okay. She married a stockbroker named Edwin Pond Parker II in 1917. He was from an old family in Connecticut. His mother was not pleased with the marriage, that he married this Jewish girl from New York. About marrying him, Dorothy Parker had said, "It's a good, clean name." So you have to understand, like I was saying before, with anti-Semitism being as blatant as it was in those days, you know, she was delighted to go from having the name Rothschild to having the name Parker. Okay. The marriage was never great. Shortly after, and he was not able to emotionally give her what she was very needy, and he wasn't emotionally as available as she needed him to be. But at any rate, he went off to war shortly after they were married. When he left to go off to war, he was an alcoholic. When he came back, he was a morphine addict. Apparently, this was not uncommon in World War I, where it was soldiers had easier access to morphine on the front than they did to alcohol. And when he came back, a drug addict, he was sent from sanitarium to sanitarium to try to get off drugs and get off alcohol and clean himself up. And it was just a tumultuous, very difficult time and a terrible marriage. And eventually in 1928, they did divorce. There was another marriage in Dorothy Parker's life. In 1934, when she was 40 years old, she married a writer-actor named Alan Campbell. You know, again, there were big gaps in what we know, partly because a lot wasn't written and recorded about her and her life, but partly just because of the era and what kind of things were spoken about and what kind of things were not spoken about. But it's largely assumed that Alan Campbell may have been bisexual. Certainly Dorothy Parker made some cracks about that. It was, in any case, we do know that he loved her very much and he took excellent care of her. He really doted on her, but you know, it was certainly a complicated relationship. They were screenwriting partners. I mean, they went out to California together, and all those films that she worked on together with Alan Campbell. They divorced in 1947, but then 1950, they got married again. But the second time they were married, they really weren't they didn't really live like husband and wife. It's understood that they lived more like roommates. There is a very sad postscript to this story, which is that Alan Campbell committed suicide in 1963. Dorothy Parker found him dead with an empty bottle of Seconal and a plastic dry cleaner's bag wrapped around his head. Still and yet, Dottie disputed the fact that it was a suicide. Okay. Now I'm going to talk a bit about Dorothy Parker's social conscience. We're at that part of the presentation already. All right, so We're very fortunate that she actually wrote about her social conscience in 1939 for a publication called The New Masses. So we know when things started to kick in for a very young Dorothy Rothschild, not even Dorothy Parker, Dorothy Rothschild. So this is what she wrote in this essay called Not Enough. I think I knew what side I was on when I was about 5 years old, at which time nobody was safe from buffaloes. Keep that phrase in the back of your mind. That was Dorothy Parker's way of saying something like, it's her hyperbole, like when dinosaurs roamed the earth, at which time nobody was safe from buffaloes. It was in a brownstone in New York, and there was a blizzard, and my rich aunt, a horrible woman then and now, had come to visit. I remember going to the window and seeing the street with men shoveling snow. Their hands were purple on their shovels, and their feet were wrapped in burlap. And my aunt, looking over her shoulder, said, "Now, isn't this nice that there's this blizzard? Now all those men have work." And I knew then that it was not nice that men could work for their lives only in desperate weather, that there was no work for them in fair. And that was when I became anti-fascist, at the silky tones of my rich and comfortable aunt. So you see, Dorothy Parker was in fact Antifa. Okay. So Dorothy Parker started becoming an activist. Okay, I think okay, I think two of my slides got mixed up, but that's okay. We're going to go here first. Dorothy Parker's activism began during the famous murder trial in 1920 of Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti were two Italian immigrants, anarchists, who were accused of murder. In 1927, they were sentenced to death by the judge in a trial that was very, very clearly biased. In fact, the judge had said, "I'm going to get those anarchist bastards good and proper." So what did Dorothy Parker do? She went up to Boston to protest their sentence of execution. There, she was taunted with things like being called a Bolshevik, guinea lover, New York nut, red scum. And as she was dragged away, when she was arrested, they screamed, "Hang her, give her the axe, give her 6 months, kill her." She pleaded guilty and received a $5 fine for loitering and sauntering, and was released. But when asked if the police had taken her fingerprints, she said, "No, but they left a few of theirs, the big lugs." And then she pushed up her sleeve to show the bruises they had left on her. And she really did not mind being arrested. I think it was one of her proudest moments. I'm going to go back to that other slide. Okay, so I do want to mention this because this is from a 1956 interview in Paris Review, only because people sometimes ask me if she was a feminist, and she used the word herself, and I know that it was a word that was used by the suffragettes. She said, "I am a feminist, and you must remember that from my very early days, when this city was scarcely safe from buffaloes," there's that phrase again, "I was in the struggle for equal rights for women. We paraded through the catcalls of men, and we chained ourselves to lampposts to try to get our equality." So yes, this was who Dorothy Parker was for a very, very long time, and a big chunk of her life. So Dorothy Parker, about a decade after this whole thing happened with Sacco and Vanzetti, she went on to help launch the Screenwriters Guild. At that point, she was earning enough money. She didn't need a union, but she wanted to help writers who were being pushed around by the studios. So she helped launch this, the Screenwriters Guild, to help, writers have some more clout. This was violently opposed by the studios, who tried to convince the writers to join a union that the studios themselves started. And Dorothy Parker had said about that, expecting the studios to represent the rights of writers was like trying to get laid in your mother's house. Somebody was always in the parlor watching. So beyond launching the Screenwriters Guild, Dorothy Parker raised funds for the defense of the Scottsboro Boys, who were African-American teenagers who were falsely accused of raping two women in Alabama. And I know this is one of those things that gets a little lost in history. So I'm just going to read to you from the Wikipedia, what Wikipedia said about the Scottsboro Boys. They were 9 Black teenagers falsely accused in Alabama of raping 2 white American women on a train in 1931. The landmark set of legal cases from this incident dealt with racism and the right to a fair trial. The cases included a lynch mob before the suspects had been indicted, a frame-up, all-white juries, rush trials, and disruptive mobs. It's frequently cited as an overall miscarriage of justice in the United States legal system. So Dorothy Parker tried to raise funds to, or did raise funds to try to help their legal defense. Soon, Parker's attention was drawn to Europe as anti-Semitism swept through Germany with terrifying force. She was instrumental in founding the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League to help spread the word about Hitler. Did she pay the price for her activities? In fact, she did. Dorothy Parker came to the attention of the House Un-American Activities Committee when her friends began falling victim to McCarthyism, some of them serving prison sentences. Dorothy Parker couldn't hold back. In 1947, she delivered provocative remarks at a rally to raise defense funds for her fellow writers. She informed the audience she had come to damn the souls of the committee and its chairman. The next day, she read in the New York Daily News that the House Un-American Activities Committee planned to subpoena her. She was undeterred and went to Washington to attend several hearings, wasn't shy about voicing her disgust. Later, at a fundraising reception in New York, she said, "For heaven's sake, children, fascism isn't coming. It's here. It's dreadful. Stop it." So as it happened, the agents didn't visit her home until 1951. But when they visited, they peppered her with questions. They pulled out, clippings and quotes and asked her if she had attended any Communist Party meetings with these other people. They had all these, lies and innuendos, and all the time they were questioning her. Dorothy Parker's little dog was nipping at their heels, pulling on their pants legs, jumping on them, and just barking and yipping and going crazy. So then when they asked if she conspired to overthrow the US government, she replied, "Listen, I can't get my dog to stay down. Do I look to you like someone who could overthrow the government?" She was eventually called to the witness stand in 1955 and invoked the Fifth Amendment. She was never proved to be a communist, and eventually the House Un-American Activities Committee decided she was not dangerous enough to arrest. But, of course, like anybody who got embroiled in McCarthyism, her career was derailed for a decade. Okay, so now we're getting to the part of the presentation where I'm going to talk to you about Parker's final years. She died at age 73, and her final years, she didn't have a healthy last few years. She was living in a hotel in New York City. Her activism days were clearly behind her. She wasn't going to march on Selma or anywhere else for that matter, but she did pay great attention to the civil rights movement, and she was very drawn to it. So in 1965, she met with her lawyer to draw up her will. So, um, you know, there were no discussions about, leaving any money to charitable donations or bequests to, friends or people she loved. There were no trinkets for friends. In fact, there was just one individual mentioned, and he was a total stranger. She wanted her entire estate bequeathed to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And her hope was that when Dr. King died, which she, I guess hoped and assumed would be many decades later, the estate would then pass to the NAACP. But Dorothy Parker died in 1967, and as you know, Dr. King was assassinated in 1968. So at that point, um, you know, her estate was then owned by the NAACP, which still makes royalties on Dorothy Parker's work. Since she died on June 7th, 1967, at age 73. So now, before I talk about it, it's really important. I really want to end telling you about Dorothy Parker's final remains. It's a fascinating postscript to her life, but I can't get to that before telling you a little bit about Lillian Hellman, who was the executor of Dorothy Parker's estate. If you don't know who Lillian Hellman was, she was a very famous playwright at the time and the lover of the writer Dashiell Hammett. All right, so Dorothy Parker and Lillian Hellman first met at a Greenwich Village cocktail party in 1931. Dashiell Hammett was there. Dorothy Parker was such a big fan of his. And, she had actually written a review of one of his books and called him as American as a sawed-off shotgun. She had also said, there is entirely too little screaming about his work. So at any rate, when she met him, she had had maybe a few too many. She actually fell to her knees in front of him and gushed and gushed and gushed about how brilliant he was. Probably making sort of a fool of herself, but it certainly did not endear her to Lillian Hellman, who later had a fight with Dashiell about it. She said, how could she respect a man who just stood there and simpered when a famous woman kissed his hands in public? That said, they met again in Hollywood in 1934. And at that point, they really did hit it off and became wonderful friends. Not surprising, they had a lot in common. They were both provocateurs. They both understood the importance of organizing the Screenwriters Union. They were obsessed with the larger issues of capitalism and communism, and the specter of fascism in Europe. And they were the two most famous women writers of their day. So, they really did enjoy each other's company. The one sore point was that Lillian Hellman did not like Dorothy's husband, Alan Campbell. But once, after Lillian apologized for snapping at him by saying he made her nervous, Dorothy replied, "Dear Lily, you'd be psychotic if you didn't." Dorothy Parker, in 1944, Viking published the first copy of the Portable Dorothy Parker, and people please, it's still being printed to this day. If you're a Dorothy Parker fan and you don't have a copy of the Portable Dorothy Parker, which has so many of her wonderful stories and poems and essays, I highly recommend that you pick up a copy. But at any rate, this was how she inscribed that original edition. For Miss Hellman, the most beautiful, the most rich, the most chic, the most dashing, the most mysterious, the most fragrant, the most nobly born, the most elegant, the most cryptic, the most startling, the most glorious, the most lovely, in short, for Miss Hellman, from Miss Parker. I don't even think she particularly meant it as hyperbole. I think she really, at that point, adored her very much. So sadly, I have to talk a little bit about what happened to her final remains. Lillian Hellman was surprised by the will. She was the executor, but she expected to be left the rights to Dorothy Parker's estate. So she was shocked that it all went to Dr. King. And she really did not respect Parker's wishes. Dorothy Parker did not want a funeral of any kind, either formal or informal, but Hellman threw a star-studded funeral with herself as the uh, at center stage. Um, and Also, interestingly, after Parker's death, Lillian tried to block the writing of a biography on Parker, telling everyone not to speak to the author. Um, and it has also been noted that every piece of paper disappeared after Dorothy Parker's death. Nothing, no correspondence, nothing was ever found. When Lillian Hellman cleaned out her apartment, everything was destroyed. So this is why, like I said at the beginning of the presentation, there are great big gaps in our knowledge of Dorothy Parker. So Parker was cremated. She did leave instructions that she was to be cremated. She did not, however, leave instructions as to the disposition of the ashes. She hadn't, left anything about an urn. So her ashes were put into something like a coffee can, and they remained in this coffee can at the funeral home unclaimed. After the funeral, Hellman just, ignored queries from the funeral home about what to do with the ashes. And then finally, in 1973, the funeral parlor sort of ran out of patience and said they demanded a response. And she said, fine, ship them to the lawyer's office on Wall Street. And there they stayed until one day in 1987. In 1987, when Dorothy Parker's biographer, Marion Mead, called up the lawyer, Paul O'Dwyer, and told him she was preparing to visit Parker's grave in Ferncliff, which was where she knew that Parker's family had a plot. So she just naturally assumed that her ashes were interred there. And O'Dwyer said, oh, she's not there. Of course she is. If it was one thing, Marion Mead knew, it was where Dottie was buried. He said, oh no, I'm looking right at her. He had her there in his office and, came to explain how she came to be in his care. And her ashes were in a coffee can in a filing cabinet in his office. So at that point, arrangements were made to send the ashes to the NAACP headquarters in Baltimore. And she was buried in Baltimore with this lovely plaque, which they put, excuse my dust on it, which she had specified she wanted to be her epitaph. And there she stayed all these many years. There is another postscript to Dorothy Parker's remains, however, and this is very, very recent news. Last September, when the NAACP announced that they were moving their headquarters from Baltimore to Washington, D.C., something had to be done with a, decision had to be made about what to do with Dorothy Parker's remains. So after consultations with her family, her ashes were at last moved to Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. And so at last, Mrs. Parker is back in her beloved New York after having been, born in New Jersey and not New York, and buried in Baltimore, not New York. It is sort of nice to know that, she is back in her hometown that she wrote so lovingly about. I'm going to get to your questions in just a minute. I'm very excited to answer your questions. I wouldn't be a struggling author, however, if I didn't just give a little plug for some of my books. As you know, I wrote Farewell, Dorothy Parker, Dorothy Parker Drank Here. My book, which came out last summer, is called Love Sold Separately. It's actually a murder mystery, though it doesn't look like it, but it's a lighthearted yet edgy murder mystery. And I have another book coming out called The Rooftop Party. Just a little bit of housekeeping before I get to your questions. Listen, I was very, very happy to offer you this presentation for free. I've given this presentation numerous times, and various organizations have hired me to give the presentation. I was happy to do it for free. And I assumed it would be free on my end. However, I discovered that my Zoom account couldn't accommodate this larger crowd, so I had to pay for the big meeting add-on. So this is my way. I'm not, I'm not too proud to beg. If you would like to leave me a tip, you could go to my website, and you can go to, there's a button that says pay me that has a link to my PayPal and my Venmo. So if you have a little jingle in your jeans and you feel like leaving me a tip that would help defray the cost of this presentation, I would love that. If not, no worries. I do hope you will, however, subscribe to my newsletter to get news about my books. And thus ends the portion of the embarrassing portion of the presentation. And now I am delighted to take your questions. Brooke, has anybody, oh, somebody said Venmo address. If you go to my website and click that pay me, there's a direct link to my Venmo. So it's right there on my website. Brooke, has anybody written in any questions?
So I have written down all of the questions that have been added, that have been asked during the presentation. I have it on my phone. If you want, I can text it to you, or I can read them out, or I can do both.
Why don't you read them to me one by one? And
I'm also sending them so I could see them easier.
We'll see how many we have time to get to. And by the way, guys, I know I gave you a lot of information. It was a long presentation. I hope I kept it lively and interesting. And I thank you so much for sticking with me. Now let's see, let's have the first question.
Okay, so Patricia asks, did she ever say anything nice as a critic?
Yes, in fact, she did. She gushed about several writers. You probably asked that before I got to the part of the presentation where I talked about how much she gushed about Dashiell Hammett. But she loved F. Fitzgerald. She loved Hemingway. I mean, she thought Hemingway was a god of a writer. Hemingway, as it happens, was not as kind to her. He was quite cruel to her. Made fun of her when she walked out of a room. I mean, I'll never forgive Hemingway for the way he treated Dorothy Parker. I suspect she had a crush on her, that she had a crush on him. So yeah, she did. When she liked something, she gushed and gushed and gushed. Of course, those aren't as lively and as interesting as when she sort of aimed her barbs at people. Next question.
Okay, so Bart Miller says that they have a passenger list for a cruise that Dorothy took to Bermuda on the Bremen. Her tablemates were a man who would become one of Hitler's military aides and Colonel Hodges, who was later one of Eisenhower's commanders. That table was either deadly silent or she completely hijacked it. Do you have any information about this?
This is news to me, and it's one of the reasons I love doing these presentations, because I learn stuff from you folks. Now I want to look into that and learn all sorts of new stuff. Thank you for sharing that. I did not know anything about that cruise. So that's great info to have. I know I'm going to be Googling some point tonight or tomorrow. Next question.
Susan Kennedy asked if she had any siblings and did she have a relationship with any of them?
Yes, so she was the youngest of four, and she had a sister, Helen, who she was very close to, and she had two brothers. She wasn't as close to them as she was to her sisters, but she maintained a relationship with her siblings all throughout her life. So she never did have children. She wanted to, and she actually had a miscarriage at one point. She had a famous abortion, but she also had a miscarriage. So the relatives that she has today are, the nieces and nephews of her, the children of her sister and her brothers. So, yeah. And they were much older. So, she was kind of like an only child in some ways, even though she had three siblings. Next question.
So Wendy White asked, how did Dorothy Parker die that seemed so young?
It's interesting because a lot of people assume that she must have died by suicide, because she did famously attempt suicide numerous times in different ways, from slitting her wrists. She once actually, believe it or not, drank boot polish, which was it was very poisonous in those days, and it was not an uncommon way to try to kill yourself. But she survived all of her attempts. But she died of natural causes. She died of a heart attack at age 73. Like I said, toward the end, she was not healthy. She was a drinker and she was a smoker. She was a very, very heavy drinker. And I'm sure that added to her demise. It also added to, she looked much older than she was at the end of her life. In fact, if you get to see that little clip of her in Saboteur, she was only in her 50s and she looks like 20 years older than that. And I really think that that was just the ravages of alcohol on her face. Her eyelids were puffy and she looked just terrible. So she did not take good care of herself. I don't think, she was really interested in longevity, clearly, and she did outlive almost all of her friends. So, which was why, she made Lillian Hellman her executor. Most of her friends were dead. And, one of the questions people often ask me is, why did she name Lillian Hellman her executor? She was such a difficult woman, and she was a difficult woman, but she was a very savvy businesswoman, and Dorothy Parker was terrible with money, and Lillian was very good with money, and she managed Dashiell Hammett's estate. So Parker assumed, I know I'm going off on a tangent, that Lillian would be the appropriate person to make executor of her estate. Other questions?
Someone asked, Tracy Walker asks, is that NAACP plaque still with her ashes?
Oh, I don't know. I think not, but I don't know. That's a good question. See, I can't answer all of them, but I do my best.
Yeah.
I assume not, because it was sort of specific to the Baltimore site. But I'm not sure what happened to the plaque. Maybe it's in the NAACP headquarters now in DC. I don't know.
And so Michael Alaka, I might be mispronouncing that, sorry, asks, could you comment on Hellman and Zero Mostel being the only speakers at Parker's memorial service?
Well, Hellman liked to make herself the star. And I know that Zero Mostel sort of got it. He knew that this wasn't what Parker wanted at all. So they were, two very famous people, and people like to hear famous people talk. So, they got up and eulogized Dorothy Parker. But, the old gang, they were all gone. Robert Benchley wasn't around, and Alexander Woolcott wasn't around, and Robert Sherwood wasn't around. F. Scott Fitzgerald wasn't around. They were all gone by that point. So, this is who was there to eulogize her. Any other questions?
Kimberly Mussel asks, how large is your Dorothy collection?
Oh, well, books that Dorothy Parker wrote or written about her. Listen, she doesn't have a lot of books. There were several collections of poetry.
How many copies of the portable Dorothy Parker do you have?
I have several copies of the portable Dorothy Parker. People tend to pick up what they see as collectible editions of the book and very kindly buy it for me. So I've lost count, but I actually do have numerous and sundry editions of the portable Dorothy Parker. I do not, however, have the first paperback copy of it that I bought, which I read it so much, when you have a paperback and the spine cracks and the pages start to fall out. So that was trashed many years ago. I wish I still had it. Might be kind of fun to have that, but that issue's gone. Any other questions?
Well, someone is confused about Venmo and says that they need the last 4 digits of your telephone number, which sounds fake.
They don't. They can go to my website and click on the Venmo link. So.
And Tracy Walker also asks, is there an anthology of her Vanity Fair and Vogue writing?
There is not an anthology of her Vanity Fair and Vogue writing. However, some of you probably know Kevin Fitzpatrick, who runs the Dorothy Parker Society. He did put together a collection of her Broadway reviews. So if you go on Amazon or wherever you buy books, you can probably find that volume. So it's a big collection of her Broadway reviews, and that's really interesting as well.
Yeah, and as of right now, there are no more questions, although if you have more questions, feel free to type them in the chat. Although Susan Weiss, hi Susan, says that that she thinks she read that the plaque has remained in Baltimore, but she'll try to find out and let you know.
Okay, Susan Weiss is from Baltimore, so she's our
Yes.
inside info there.
Gloria Urban asked if you can recommend your favorite blog.
My favorite blog?
Yeah, that's what's being asked. Your fave blog.
I don't know. I mean, I think I'm on social media so much these days. I probably don't read blogs that much, and if I do read blogs,
Oh, biography.
Bio.
Bio. I can't read. That was an I and not an L.
Okay,
That's
okay.
That's my bad.
Yes, the Marion Mead biography of Dorothy Parker is absolutely the best one. It's called What Fresh Hell. It's absolutely, it's the biography of Dorothy Parker that has the most accurate information, and it's chock-a-block full of wonderful stuff. So Marion Mead, Meade, I really, really recommend it.
And Gloria Urban asked, what is your most favorite poem?
Most favorite poem?
Yes.
I think the ones that I read, I mean, I like all of those. And there are probably a few others, but I think, Resume is great. I love anything that ends with a line of sarcasm. I just, can't get over when you can be sarcastic or witty in a poem. And like I said, when I was a teenager, I was just so shocked to discover a writer who seemed to understand the human heart so well, because that's what she did in a lot of her poetry. She really understood heartbreak, and that was the thing that got me as a teenager, the heartbreak thing, because teenagers are so wrapped up in heartbreak. But as I got older, I, came to appreciate her in so many other ways. And, like I said, when I reimagined her for my books, it was so important for me to be respectful and to pay homage to the whole person. So I think, what time is it? Yeah, I think it's, we're probably coming to the end. Is there any other questions?
Let's see. Peter Feibelman asks, can you imagine a Dorothy Parker writing today? Where is her sentiments, or would her sentiments be on current events, do you think?
Ooh, you just love to think about Dorothy Parker writing today. I think that she would be very, very political if she was writing today. And I think she'd have a few sharp words to say. Yeah, so I do like to think, and I like to imagine her in the modern world. I like to imagine how she would comment on all different things that are going on in this world today. I think she probably would have a few things to say that would help us wrap our mind around current events in a fresh and new way. So I think that's it. Like I said, I'm very excited and that you all came. We did record this presentation, so you will be able to revisit it. I'll send everybody a link. And I really do hope that you'll subscribe to my newsletter and get information about my books. So that's it. Thanks so much for coming. And I really enjoyed giving this presentation to you guys. And Rook, thank you so much for the technical help. Okay, good night, everybody.